Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail. Today we are going to share park ranger horror stories. First story. I found an abandoned mine while working as a park ranger. It started out as just a routine night on the job as a park ranger. Or more specifically in my case, just a routine night on the job as a park ranger in Arizona. It was a job I loved as I'd been on the team for years, and I had no reason to want to change that. I adored the scenery, the desert canyons, the saguaro cactus that dotted the horizon, and everything that came with it. I even loved the job at night. In fact, I especially loved working at night. That's my favorite time to patrol the park. There had just been a recent series of dust storms in the area, so the park had been closed for several days, and tomorrow was the first full day back. Our job today had been to prepare for the reopening, and we had been tasked with double-checking the park to make sure nothing was amiss or out of place. And lucky for me, I had gotten the chance to patrol the area as night was settling in. I had just rounded a corner and was straightening my Jeep out on the road when I noticed something looked slightly out of place. I'd been on this stretch of road literally 1,000 times by now, but thanks to the huge dust storm, the nearby canyon wall had been swept clear of dust, and now you could see that a section of rock wall had been removed and replaced with something else. So I immediately pulled over, turned on my flashlight, and hopped out of the Jeep to investigate. It didn't take long to see that this wasn't some random gap in the canyon wall, but a man-made opening that had been boarded up many years ago. The wood was badly damaged and weathered by the elements, and it had only been the years of sand and debris that kept it hidden this long. I felt a ripple of excitement as I held my flashlight up to it. From all the years I've been on the job and lived out here, I was pretty sure this was the opening to a mine. Not only had I seen plenty in my time out west, but part of the land that was now the park had belonged to a mining company. There had been rumors there was a mine under the land, but nothing had ever been found or confirmed. Until now. And I made it official by using my Jeep radio to let my colleagues know my location and what I'd found. The ranger base radioed back they had received my message and were sending some of my colleagues to help investigate with me, and I should wait until they arrived. I confirmed I understood my instructions, and then I returned to my Jeep and waited. My fellow rangers arrived relatively quickly, and once they had their flashlights in hand, we all carefully approached the badly boarded up entrance. There were now 4 of us: Holly, Christian, Fletcher, and myself. The wooden beams were barely held in place by rusty nails and were pulled off easily. Once they were all laying cast aside on the rocky ground, we shined our flashlights into the now exposed entrance. Now, there was no doubt it was the opening to a mine. The wooden beams lining the walls and the rusty track lining the floor confirmed this had been used in mining. Since I had been the one to find this place, my fellow rangers let me do the honors, and I led the way into the dusty and arid tunnel. The tunnel went on for about a mile until it passed by an open section of rock wall on our left. It was jagged and rough, but we could just see that it led straight to a mine shaft many stories below us. But when we looked straight down at the mine shaft with our flashlights in hand, I almost recoiled in shock. The mine shaft floor was almost completely covered with snakes. Only the slightest bit of mine floor was visible for us to see, and even from this distance, it was obvious they were diamondback rattlesnakes. We'd all seen many of them while working here, but seeing so many of them in one place didn't feel real. I could practically feel their movements, even though I was far above them. The fact that so many of them got here in one place was mind-boggling. It all looked like something out of a documentary, and if you stared at it long enough, there was the brief illusion that the floor was moving. Wow, Holly muttered as she looked at the snakes just below us. Wow is right, Christian agreed. Definitely something to document. We did just that before we carried on. Once we left the snakes behind, the four of us walked in relative silence for about 5 minutes until we came to a turn in the tunnel, and we could feel it descending further into the earth. The air was even cooler here, and we kept at a steady pace until we arrived at a fork in the tunnel. "All right, what do we do now?" Fletcher asked. "Shall we split up?" Christian suggested. "Works for me," I said. "I'll take the left." "I'll go with you," Fletcher volunteered. "Cool. Then we'll head this way," Holly nodded. Once we radioed the base what we were doing and got confirmation they understood, we proceeded. When Fletcher and I headed down the left tunnel, Holly and Christian disappeared behind the dense rock wall separating the tunnels, and that was it. Fletcher and I walked at the same pace as the left tunnel veered far off from the path we'd been going down. After twisting sharply to the left, it evened out until we found ourselves in a narrow cavern that led to a dead end. With my flashlight in hand, I took a closer look at where we were. The ceiling was dotted with stalactites, and the ground was covered in sand and a few rocks. Fletcher was right behind me as we quietly checked everything out. I was just about to say we should go back when I saw right in the corner there was a section of wall that was a bit smoother than the rest. When I took a closer look, it appeared like a bit of the floor was boarded up. "Come over here," I called to Fletcher. He immediately walked over to where I was looking and saw I'd found something. After we both took a moment to look at it, we were able to see it was a trapdoor, and there was a rusted handle in the middle of the wooden frame. "Shall we give it a try?" Fletcher asked. I nodded, and we both took hold and tugged. It was heavy and took a ton of strength, but after a moment, it jolted open with a loud crack. Once we eased it open, we shined our flashlights down into the opening. It was a simple climb down a bit of cavern steps, and it opened to another path. But why had it been closed off? People had probably fallen back when this was an operating mine. After we briefly reported what we'd found back to base, we slowly descended the steps. Once we were both back on flat terrain, we took the space in. You couldn't see it from above, but this part of the mine connected to a winding path that led further down into what I assumed was the pit. This time, Fletcher went first, and I followed him. We had walked for almost a mile down the winding path when Fletcher moved a stationary mine cart out of the way, and it inadvertently crashed into the rock wall beside us with a loud bang that seemed to echo in the space. "Sorry," he said to me. "No worries." But in the beam from my flashlight, I could see the mine cart hitting the rock wall had disturbed the earth around it, and an opening had appeared in the ground. And moments later, I could see shapes coming out of it. I immediately recognized them as Arizona bark scorpions, and they were crawling out of the wall at a fast pace, and before too long, they had completely covered the space separating Fletcher and myself. Especially because we had both been in the job long enough to know you didn't want to get stung by one, much less the dozens crawling out. So we immediately backed up and away from each other. "I guess I'll go this way, and you keep going that way," I said as I pointed to the other way the tunnel went. "Sounds good. I'll catch up with you." And with that, I was back on my own. I followed the path in the other direction, and before too long, I came to another end, but this time it was marked by a huge pile of rocks. When I got close, I could feel the breeze coming from somewhere, so I knew this led outside. So I slowly started removing rocks, and before too long, there was a narrow path for me to climb through to reach the other side. And once I put my flashlight back on my belt, I started to climb through the rocks and feel my way through. Moments later, I was in the pleasant nighttime air again. The breeze felt amazing after being in the dusty mine for so long, and I took a moment to get oriented. I was far away from the park now, and I was in the middle of a rocky canyon overlooking the desert terrain a level below. It was an incredible sight. All those saguaro cacti dotting the night landscape, while other brush lined the desert floor. But then far on the horizon, I saw something coming this way, something kicking up a lot of dust. It was a car, and its headlights were blazing bright against the darkness that had settled over everything. The sight filled me with dread, so I immediately ducked behind a rock wall and watched. A lone car driving out in the desert at night is never a good sign, especially when the road doesn't exactly lead this way. It didn't happen often, but occasionally, rangers have found things out here over the years. Unnerving things. Things that suggested something bad happened without coming right out and saying it. It's no surprise because there's nowhere to run in the desert. There aren't many trees to climb up in, no forest you can camouflage yourself with, and no abandoned cabin you can run into. Unless you get lucky and there's an abandoned mine around, you are well and truly at the mercy of whatever is out there. And most of the time, that means you're at the mercy of nature, or even worse, people who didn't know the meaning of the word merciful. Out of instinct, I checked my belt, and my stomach lurched when I realized my walkie-talkie was gone. Probably got stuck in the rocks I climbed through. But I still had my heavy flashlight. That was more important, because it could come in handy if push came to shove. Then I quickly tried to crawl my way back to the mine to get help. But then cold fear hit me as I realized there had been a cave-in or something, as heavier rocks had replaced the much lighter ones I had moved. I quietly struggled for a moment until it was obvious they weren't budging. So I had no choice but to return to my hiding spot and think of what else to do. So I took a deep breath and watched the vehicle, which was a truck, bounce over countless dips in the ground. There were no paved streets out here, so the truck was constantly kicking up dust and swerving roughly. I had no idea what was going on, but I had a feeling, and it gave me a chill. Naivety is a luxury most people can't afford anymore. The truck's headlights were almost unnaturally bright, gleaming harshly against the desert sand. If anyone else accidentally stumbled onto the scene, I doubt they'd wonder about what was happening out here at night either. As I could tell, there were two most likely options: money changing hands or something worse. It was just a question of which one it would be. In fact, it was entirely possible it could be both. As the truck got closer, I could see it was gray, and although the windows weren't tinted, I couldn't see who was inside. Moments later, the truck slammed to a halt in an open patch of land that was just close enough for me to see what was happening. Then all was eerily quiet for a moment until all four doors opened at the same time, and one man got out of each door. The truck's front was facing me, so I had a direct view as the two guys on the driver's side pulled a fifth guy out of the back seat and dragged him roughly along with them. Not a good sign, especially because even at this distance, I could see they were armed in addition to carrying flashlights to see where they were walking. And you could tell the guy was scared. No surprise there, since they had no concern about him seeing their faces. That meant they weren't worried about what came after this little rendezvous. But even if they'd done that, he probably knew who they were. While I could practically smell the fear coming off him, he didn't look surprised or shocked. In fact, I felt a shock of recognition when I realized the guy looked familiar. He was a local businessman who disappeared about a week ago. The story was some people had shown up unannounced at his house, and without saying a word, kicked the door in, dragged him out, and stuffed him in the back of a car in the middle of the night. And rumor was the people responsible were a local gang famous for violence intended to shock and horrify. But since this guy was well known and had some power in town, rumor was they decided to make an example of him in another way by making him disappear. By now they had dragged the guy, who I remembered was Mason Winters, towards a spot in the middle of the area. He was dressed in a suit that was clearly expensive but had also seen better days. But then I realized that 3 of the 4 guys were dragging Winters, while the 4th was retrieving something from the back of the truck. I briefly wondered how many times they'd done this. From their demeanor, they seemed beyond nonchalant about it all, like it was the most routine thing in the world to them, which very well could be the case. Then the guy found what he wanted from the trunk. It was a shovel, which he tossed at the ground by where his associates had shoved Mason Winters and left him. "Dig," I could hear him faintly say from where I was hiding. There was no further explanation needed, as Winters picked up the shovel, stood up, and slowly started digging. I could see the first few shovelfuls were hard, but it started to come easier. He shoveled back and forth in what seemed like a never-ending motion. I could practically feel their gaze on him as each shovelful brought him one step closer to the end, and the air was thick with adrenaline and tension. I was sweating despite the cool night air, and I didn't want to look, but I had no choice. It wasn't long before Winters began to feel the ache in his arms, because he definitely slowed down the longer he dug. The 4 men didn't say a word the entire time, as they merely leaned against the truck and one of them lit up a cigarette. When he did, the brief flash of a lighter stood out in the darkness for a moment. The hole was slowly getting bigger and bigger, as was the pile of dirt beside it. Before too long, it'd be the proper dimensions, and then it would all be over. Or it would be unless I did something, which is what I had planned. I had some rocks ready, and when the moment came, I would hurl some as far as I could in the other direction and cause some paranoia and distraction. Maybe give Winters the chance to get the upper hand. He didn't strike me as the type to back down from a fight easily. He may have been terrified, and his arms were probably aching with every movement, but he was dignified. Not once did he beg or plead for his life. I also noticed it felt unnaturally quiet. No sign of any animals or any other forms of desert life. I'm not sure if that made the situation better or worse. "All right, that's good enough," one of the four armed men suddenly commanded. As Winters stopped digging, I gripped one of the rocks tightly in my hand. It was time. I was aiming to throw it where it would make plenty of noise. Fear shivered down my spine as I got ready to act. But just as I was about to throw, there was a sound from somewhere out there in the desert. Something between a snap and a crack, and the suddenness of it after the deafening silence was disconcerting. "What was that?" The one who told Winters to stop asked. He was about medium height, and he had an athletic build. "No idea. Come with me and look." The driver nodded at him. "You two, watch him," he said to the other two gunmen while pointing at Winters. The two of them headed in the direction the sound had come from while Winters stood in front of the hole with two pairs of eyes on him. From where they were headed, it looked like the sound had come from behind a small canyon covered in sand. "What the hell?" I heard the driver ask after about 3 minutes. Was all the other guy managed to get out before I heard a deafening roar that was immediately followed by the sound of gunfire and a blood-curdling scream. The other two gunmen watching Winters immediately jumped and ran to check out what was going on. Winters grabbed the shovel again and watched from behind the mound of dirt as the two men ran to where their associates had been only to be stopped dead in their tracks as the driver sprinted towards them, his clothes and face splattered with blood. "Run for the truck," he screamed at them. But before he could lead them in that direction, something grabbed him from behind and dragged him out of sight while he thrashed and screamed. The flashlight in his hand lay there motionless on the ground, casting a beam onto the sand. The two remaining gunmen also dropped their flashlights as they tried to honor their instructions and sprinted towards the truck, any thoughts of Winters long since forgotten. They were halfway there when something stepped in their path. I watched in shock as a shape on 4 legs that seemed to loom out of the darkness launched itself at them with a ferocity I had never seen before. Like anyone, I had heard stories of what creatures may lurk in the desert. I hadn't given it much thought as an adult because there were many more pressing monsters to be afraid of. Who has time to worry about a monster that may or may not exist when you are surrounded by monsters you know exist? Winters audibly gasped at the same time both gunmen yelled out. One tried to aim and fire his gun, but the creature stood on its hind legs and slashed his arm with claws that looked lethally long before he could fire a single shot. He let out a wail of pain as he fell to the ground. The other one tried to keep running to the truck. I could hear his heavy breathing as he panted, but he was no match for the creature. It pounced on him and sunk its teeth into his neck, silencing him instantly. Meanwhile, his associate was still crawling on the ground, trying to get to cover in the truck. In the blink of an eye, whatever that thing was landed on top of him, and after the gunman briefly cried out, he went quiet. Now it was silent again, and the only source of light out on the desert floor was the discarded flashlights. But that thing was still out there, because you could occasionally hear movement coming from the darkness. Winters heard it too, because he stayed hidden behind the massive dirt pile and kept quiet. Good move. An eternity passed before I heard what sounded like footfalls going in the opposite direction. Then it was gone. Winters noticed the same thing, because he peeked out from behind the dirt mound and saw there was no sign of that thing. No doubt he was feeling painfully exposed out there in the middle of the desert more than ever. Then, somehow, the feeling in the air returned to normal, and the desert felt more like the desert once again. I couldn't tell you how or why it happened, but something shifted in the air, and now this felt more like the desert I'd spent an incalculable amount of time in. So after I cleared my throat and tried to shake off the shock of the situation, I stood up and called out, "Hey, Winters, over here." He turned to look at me so fast it was impressive. I had no doubt the poor guy was on edge, but I thought that was better than sneaking up on him. "Who are you? And how do you know who I am?" He yelled back to me. "I'm a park ranger, and I've seen you all over the news. How did you get out here?" "Found a hidden mine shaft and followed it here." He paused while he took this in. "How long were you up there?" "Not long. I got here right before you arrived." He began. "Did something come out of nowhere and attack my unwanted associates?" "Indeed. I thought so, but I wanted to check and make sure I wasn't hallucinating or something. Saying I'm lucky that things showed up doesn't even come close to describing it. I was going to cause a little diversion if it didn't. My walkie-talkie got lost in the mine, otherwise I would have called for help. I appreciate that. On that note, do you mind lending me a ride?" I pointed to the truck that sat there silently. "No problem. Come on down, and we'll get the hell out of there." He didn't need to say anything more. Now I felt better about turning my flashlight back on as I walked down from where I was to the truck. I still felt the adrenaline running through my body, but it was more muted. Plus, it was nothing compared to how Winters must be feeling. So I just put one foot in front of the other and walked towards the truck. While I was far less wary now, I did keep my eye on the truck and paid attention to my peripheral vision as I approached Winters while I walked through the cactus-lined sand. Eventually, Winters was in front of me. He studied my appearance, obviously checking my uniform. After a moment, he held his hand out in front of him, and we shook hands. I could feel how raw they were from digging, but he didn't flinch for a moment. "Nice to meet you," I said sincerely. "Likewise. Shall we get this show on the road?" "Absolutely." But then I paused. "Is it all right if I drive?" Winters didn't say anything, but I could feel him thinking over my request. After what seemed like a long time, but was probably less than a minute, he chuckled. "Sure thing. And smart man. I would have asked the same thing. You may have an idea of who those men are and why they took me, but you don't know specifics and have no reason to trust me or where I might take you. By all means, drive. I'm just happy to get the hell out of here at all." With that, I hopped in the driver's seat while Winters climbed in beside me. I wasn't surprised that the keys were still in the ignition. They had no reason to even consider removing them. As I briefly checked the truck, I could see bits of stuffing coming out of the upholstery in the back seat. But the truck started without any difficulty, and I slowly pulled out of there. As the area faded away in the red glow from the taillights, I watched the dust being kicked up in the truck's rearview mirror. What was left of the four men, who came out with Winters laid sprawled out on the ground, completely motionless. After a few minutes, the sight had nearly vanished in the rearview mirror, and we were well on our way towards the road back to town. "You want to know exactly what happened?" Winters asked after being quiet since we got in the truck. "Of course. The reason for my disappearance and the little ride out here was that I wouldn't pay money to some people who claimed I should for my own good. Do you know why?" "I have an idea." He chuckled. "You seem perceptive, so I'm sure you do. It's all very simple. As a businessman, it's all a question of value. Paying money is absolutely useless if they keep raising the price or there's absolutely no guarantee of safety in it. When there are 1,000 other people just waiting to take over turf or already in the area also demanding payment, it's a complete waste of money. Especially since I have no family in the area, so it wasn't like these people could use that as leverage against me. I learned to live with death a long time ago. It's like an old friend you've been expecting to show up to a party you're having. Sometimes he's early, sometimes he's late, sometimes he's right on schedule when you expect him, but he always makes a call. But like any party guest, most of the time you can't help but be nervous when he's about to come knocking. There was a lot of sense in that. So the two of us sat in comfortable silence until the vast terrain of the desert was behind us and we were almost back to town. Right before I reached the road, he turned to me. "What exactly did you plan to do if that thing hadn't shown up?" "Throw some rocks to cause a distraction and some chaos." "Interesting. What did you think that would do?" "At the very least, give you an opportunity to get the upper hand and do something. Did it not cross your mind that might make the situation worse?" I briefly glanced at him. "No. Why?" He sounded genuinely intrigued. "I watched you the whole time. You were afraid, but you were defiant. You didn't beg for your life, offer to give them whatever they wanted, or anything remotely like that. You were ready to put up a fight." Winter seemed genuinely surprised by this. Then I saw him smile for the first time. "You are observant. And you were right. Had you started throwing rocks, I would have immediately swung into action. At the very least, it would have given me a chance. You know what I was thinking of while I was digging? What? How the four of them were small time and would always be small time, no matter what happened to me. They were all expendable. Know what's going to happen now? I'll turn up and it'll be a huge news story. I'll go back to my life, and people will look at me in stunned disbelief. It'll be the story to end stories. Meanwhile, the four of them won't even be a name somewhere. They'll eventually be dumped in a hole in the ground, just like that one, and they will be replaced like they weren't even there. By the time someone figures out all isn't well and finds the remains of their associates, they'll see how badly things went. Odds are very good they won't even get near the place because the cops will get there first, but everyone will know something attacked them without so much as breaking a sweat. And it's still out there. That'll be the story. I had no doubt that was true. All of it. So I drove to the police station and escorted Winters in where we told them the story of how I got there and what happened. They brought us some coffee and contacted the ranger station to let them know everything was all right, but I'd be a while. It wasn't the worst way to spend an evening, as Winters and I got to share a pizza and some other food from a restaurant down the street. Everything Winters said came true, and his miraculous return was the big story in town. In the meantime, I went back to work, and the mine was fully explored and documented before it was properly closed off for safety reasons. The thing that was out there that night was never seen again by me or anyone in the park. If anyone else saw it, I didn't hear about it, but that didn't mean it wasn't out there. The desert has always been a place of mystery, especially at night. I don't expect that to change because that's exactly what makes it the desert, and it's something I've always loved about it. Second story. I work as a park ranger. I don't think we are preserving any known wildlife. It's already been 2 weeks since I have got a job as a park ranger. It was an isolated area meant to preserve possible near-extinction species, as they have no more than a dozen left alive. I remember that when I first applied, they made sure I went through enough training to prepare both physically and mentally. It was a very tough job according to my supervisor and would possibly include killing poachers if necessary. Of course, I wasn't sure if it was acceptable to do that instead of arresting them, but the site was pretty much far away from any possible city, so I didn't complain and went along. Everything seemed normal at the first days on my shifts. The same patrol around and make sure everything is being preserved and protected from poachers. You know, the usual park ranger duties. That is until the 11th day when I was called to do the night shift as the guard assigned to it got into a terrible accident on the way home and broke his leg. Being someone who took the job seriously, I agreed to it and stayed for the night shift. But before I could start, my supervisor went to me and explained what to do since it was different from my usual daytime shifts. Since it's your first time in this position, I can assume you're not used to this role, right? He asked me as I geared up with the night shift tools. Yes, sir, I'm not used to work until late, let alone on the dead of the night, but I've got confidence that I can do it until the other guy recovers. I answered, being a little nervous, but keeping my stance. He pulled me aside before I was about to start and explained me what I had to do and what to expect in certain situations. All right, so here are the basics. If you hear bone cracking sounds, ignore them. If you hear metal rustling, turn off your flashlight. And if you hear voices calling for you that aren't coming from your radio, shoot your gun to scare them away. Do I need to repeat anything? He asked in a serious way. And no, sir, I understood everything. If you want, I can even get a note if I forget. I answered, a bit nervous after his explanation. Good, I'll be reaching you from time to check. And as he said that, he walked away. Now alone and fully geared, I started the patrol. I was supposed to head to the north zone of the site and make sure everything is in order. The moon was shining bright, and everything was quiet and eerie. Not even owls could be heard. Everything was dead silent save for my footsteps and the voice on the radio from my supervisor. As I was already midway on the path, I started to hear the metal rustling nearby. So as instructed, I turned off my flashlight and waited. It was obviously too dark to see, but I could make a silhouette that somewhat resembled a wolf with something on its back, but it quickly ran off, and I turned on my flashlight again to keep moving. I was approaching the location. I heard the same voices I was told about. My supervisor, who also could hear it from his radio, instructed me to fire my gun, but as I was about to do it, I realized I didn't load any bullet, and I noticed the voices getting closer, but they started to fade away on the darkness. It was tempting, so despite my supervisor telling me to proceed, I went off the path and followed the voices. That's when I found the source. It looked vaguely human, but its skin was so melted that it looked like clay. It was hard to hear, but I could make some words it was trying to scream. "Help! Please, help! I beg you!" it hopelessly tried to say. I just stood there frozen, and when I turned my flashlight up, I noticed the wolf thing. It was huge, 5'5" in height if I had to guess. It had metal tendrils coming out of its back, and it just stared as it pulled the melted body humanoid as it continued to beg for help. Without any choice, I ran back to the path and kept going until I reached my destiny and found my supervisor waiting for me. He pulled me inside the radio building and quickly shut the door. "So, what did you find on the way?" he asked while panting from shutting the door. "What do you mean? I could have died because of that thing. Was it always here on the site?" I yelled while trying to get answers. He just shut me off and explained everything to me. This place had more dangerous species that were largely hunted across the globe, so they were brought here to be kept. I was still confused about the situation. Why would they want them alive? Are they really that important? The next days in the night shift were much more quieter, but from time to time I would see the wolf thing or another weird animal that I couldn't make the details. I'm not sure what this place really is or what are all the things living within the area, but I know one thing: those monsters were better off contained. Third story. Why I stay away from national parks. We had been driving through the forest for about 20 minutes when my daughter started acting strange. Kylie was ordinarily a loud, active toddler with so much energy that my wife and I usually had to drag ourselves along behind her. Yet now, in the shadow of the huge evergreens, she had fallen silent. "Everything okay back there?" I asked. No response. "You excited about visiting the park, honey? We might even see a bear." I tried again. Still nothing. Kylie was staring with absolute concentration at the shadows beneath the trees. "Kylie? Honey?" My wife, Heather, reached back and shook Kylie's knee. "There's a man in the woods," Kylie said simply. "Of course there is, honey. It's a national park." I laughed, but Kylie just scowled and looked back out the window. I sighed. The sun was just starting to cast its golden beams through the misty woods, and if Kylie was in one of her moods, we had a very long day ahead of us. I spotted a gravel turnoff up ahead, and it occurred to me that maybe Kylie was just grumpy from the long car ride. My wife and I were plenty sore ourselves, and the prospect of dipping our feet in a cool mountain stream was too good to miss. I pulled in beside a dusty pickup truck and flashed a mischievous grin at Heather. We were both out the door as soon as the wheels stopped rolling. Kylie, however, refused to budge. "This is a bad place. I don't wanna." My daughter crossed her arms. There was no reasoning with her when she was like this. I nodded to my wife, and we each grabbed an arm to lift her out of the car seat. Kylie wailed and clawed, putting up such a fight that I was grateful that I'd trimmed her nails in the hotel room the night before. I looked over my shoulder at the pickup and winced. If the driver was around, he'd probably think that Kylie was being kidnapped. "There's a creek down there with big rocks and fish and waterfalls," I cooed. "You're gonna love it, Kentucky." Suddenly, my daughter stopped crying, but it didn't have anything to do with my pep talk. "Okay, Daddy, let's go." Her arms had gone slack, her face blank. I'd only ever seen her like this once before, when our plane had hit a gut-dropping patch of turbulence, the kind that makes passengers wail, luggage fall, and lights flicker. Then as now, she just shut down, too frightened to function. I couldn't imagine what was scaring her so badly. Apart from the rustling leaves and the murmur of the stream down below, the early morning forest was still. I slipped a neon pink jacket over Kylie's head before lifting her onto my shoulders and starting down the steep, muddy trail. Heather let out a loud whoop and sprinted past me. I winced. It felt wrong to disturb the silence, I thought, then wondered if Kylie's irrational fear had infected me as well. We found Heather lying on a smooth, white stone beside the water, kicking her feet in the rapids. "It's so peaceful here," she smiled, and I had to agree. Even Kylie seemed to be doing better. She sat at the edge of the rock, absent-mindedly tugging at clumps of moss. "You're pretty quiet, champ." Heather rustled our daughter's hair. "I'm listening to the man in the woods," Kylie replied, with that same flat voice. A shiver ran up my spine. Most toddlers say creepy things from time to time, but Kylie had never gone this deep into her daydreams before. What man in the woods? Honey, nobody's talking. Yes, he is. I can hear him. He's talking inside my head. Heather and I exchanged a glance. What's the man saying? Champ? Heather asked. Kylie just frowned and pulled away, as if to say that whatever it was none of our business. The morning air suddenly seemed just a little bit cooler. A bird took off from a branch above us, and Heather and I both jumped, but not Kylie. Our daughter was staring dead ahead at something on the other side of the creek. Before either of us could stop her, she got on all fours and scurried across the smooth river rocks. It's amazing how fast small children can move when they really want to. By the time we got to our feet, Kylie was halfway across the creek. Not being a barefoot toddler myself, I slipped almost instantly, plunging into the freezing, waist-deep water. My daughter, meanwhile, had already reached the far bank. I felt a sudden, horrible certainty that if she climbed up it, we would never see her again. Fortunately, my wife was a lot less clumsy than I was. Jumping from rock to rock, she managed to grab the back of Kylie's pink jacket seconds before she disappeared into the ferns. Ordinarily, Kylie screamed her head off whenever we stopped her from doing what she wanted, but now she was calm. In fact, she was giggling. Daddy got wet. Kylie, it is not okay to run off like that. What's gotten into you? My wife demanded. He said it would be funny, our daughter replied with an all-too-adult sneer in her eyes. And he was right. Only then did it occur to me to climb the eroded bank and see what had made Kylie so eager to cross the stream. My fingers sank into the mud as I pulled myself upward, then fell back with a yelp as sharp teeth sank into my ankle. Kylie, Heather yelled. My daughter had bitten me. He doesn't like it when you look, Kylie hissed. That's enough. I grunted and picked my daughter up. She went into full tantrum mode, battering me with her tiny fists, but I was finally able to peer over the muddy creek bank. I saw only more trees, rotting logs, and a carpet of decaying leaves. Whatever Kylie had been so eager to get to, it was long gone. It was the worst fit Kylie had thrown in years, maybe ever. Getting a flailing, screaming, biting child back across the slippery rocks was no easy feat. By the end of it, all three of us were soaked and exhausted. I reached out for the car door and patted my hip for my keys. They weren't there. Had their clip come undone when I'd fallen in the water? Or had Kylie pulled them off on purpose? I didn't like to think about what that might mean. The keys. I groaned. I have to go back. Heather looked up at me from where she was struggling with Kylie. Her eyes begged me not to go. I understood how she felt. The day had suddenly turned strange and wrong, and all I wanted to do now was get back in the car with my family, drive out of the forest, and forget that any of it had ever happened. I glanced over at the pickup truck beside us. It was covered with dust and dead leaves, as though it had been sitting there abandoned for years. And what had happened to the driver? Something seemed to slither beneath the grimy blue tarp in the truck bed. I shuddered and turned back to my family. Kylie had finally calmed down. She sat in the gravel, messy hair hanging over her face, not saying a word. Babe, please, my wife whispered. Why don't we just go back to the road? We could flag someone down, ask them to call for help. Images flashed through my head. Long, hungry hours, waiting for some smug tow truck driver. Yet another bill for my already bloated credit card. Kylie crying nonstop. Our vacation ruined. No, I couldn't let that happen. All I had to do was walk back down the trail and grab my keys. So why did that suddenly feel so hard to do? I took a last look around. The winding two-lane road should have been packed, but not a single car had passed by. I could feel my wife's eyes on the back of my neck, pleading with me. Stay, they seemed to say. I'm scared. As much as I wanted to, someone had to get us out of the woods. Shivering in my waterlogged jeans, I stuffed my hands into my pockets and trudged back down the trail. I found myself wishing that somebody else would appear just to confirm that we were still inside the borders of the national park at all. A grimy backpacker, an old fisherman on his way to the creek, anybody other than Kylie's man in the woods. Although I kept my eyes down in search of the keys, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd look up and find him just in front of me, looking like the Green Knight from some childhood storybook. A mossy beard, a crown of antlers, golden animal eyes. A footstep crunched in the leaves to my left. Glancing up, I saw an enormous stag making its way through the trees. There was something unsettling about the way it moved. It didn't look my way, didn't freeze when it saw me. It just kept walking straight ahead like it was being guided by some terrible purpose. It was heading for the car. I jogged back up the slick path. The stag had reached the edge of the forest. Heather, oblivious, was squatting in the gravel, trying to talk to Kylie. My daughter sat with eerie patience, staring straight ahead, like she knew the stag was coming. From my vantage point, I could see how it walked out from the tree lean and knelt down in front of her, as though inviting her to ride it. I could hear my wife and daughter arguing. "Honey, get back. That's a wild animal. You don't know what it might do." "The man in the woods says I should go with it, Mommy. He says where I'm going, there's lots of other kids just like me." Heather had heard enough. She grabbed for Kylie's arm, but the stag came between them. Snorting and frothing at the mouth, it reared back and rammed its head into my wife's chest. Heather flew backwards, impacting against the driver's side mirror with a sickening crack. She crumpled to the ground and lay still. Kylie, meanwhile, was already climbing onto the stag's back. "No!" I screamed. "Kylie, wait!" But the big animal was already moving. My daughter clung to the mangy fur of its neck. Her golden hair flashed in a beam of sunlight. Then she and the stag were gone, swallowed by the shadows of the forest. I ran to my wife. Heather was hurt, but breathing. I was trying desperately to remember my Cub Scout first aid when I heard tires crunching on the gravel. It was an ancient Park Service vehicle, and the woman behind the wheel looked just as grizzled as the car itself. She couldn't have been older than 30, but her sharp green eyes missed nothing. "Everything all right here, sir?" the ranger asked. Her hand was on the pistol at her hip as she stepped out of the vehicle. "My wife, she was attacked by a deer," I stammered, "and my daughter, she's missing." "Let me see your hands." I did as I was told. I realized that she was looking for blood or bruising on my knuckles, signs that I had been the one to slam my wife against the side of the car. "Okay," she grunted. "Step back." She bent down to inspect Heather. My wife let out a gasp as the ranger pressed on her right side. "Ribs broken." The ranger grunted. "Should probably get her a doctor." "Now what's this I hear about a missing daughter?" I launched into my story. Leaving out the harder-to-believe elements made sense at the time. I told the ranger that Kylie had simply run off into the woods after a deer. Only later would I realize what a terrible mistake I had made. "Time's a wasting then," the ranger grunted. "Most lost kids are found within a couple hours. The ones who aren't," she trailed off, bent low over some knobs and buttons in her cruiser, then returned with a frown. "We always get bad reception out here, ma'am. Are you going to be all right to rest in the back seat of the cruiser while we look for your little girls?" My wife winced but nodded. The old-fashioned pack that the ranger extracted from her trunk looked bigger than she was, but she hitched it on her back with ease. Her uniform, too, wasn't quite what I was used to, but the Forest Service brown color was familiar enough. "Well," she asked, "you coming or not?" In between shouts of Kylie's name, the ranger introduced herself as Maddie Corvin. "We'll do a quick search of the area, but after that I'm going in for backup," Ranger Corvin said. "Keep the cruiser in sight at all times. You might think you know where the road is, but trust me, it's easy to get turned around out here." I could see what she meant. No matter which way I was facing, the carpet of ferns and dead leaves looked the same. Enormous tree trunks rose up from it like columns in some ancient temple. Then I glimpsed something that made my breath catch in my throat. A hot pink jacket. Ranger Corvin was yelling after me, but I only had thoughts for that sad little jacket laying in the mud. I ran to it, flipped it over. A pale, lifeless face stared up at me. Its eyes were hollow pits, its mouth a crimson smile sliced from ear to ear. A strangled cry escaped my lips. It took me a long moment to realize that I was looking at some sort of doll. Its head was made of an empty hornet's nest, its grin painted on with what looked like berry juice. Who would make something like this? A bony hand squeezed my shoulder, and I jumped. Maddie Corvin glared down at me. "I warned you not to run off on your own," she spat. I didn't understand why she was so angry until I looked around. I could no longer see the parking lot or the trail. I had no clue how to get back, And from the expression on Ranger Corbin's face, neither did she. She took out a compass, and we both waited while its needle spun, and spun, and spun. Ranger Corbin took a deep breath, the kind you take when you're trying to get your fear under control. She replaced the compass on the side of her pack, extracted some reflective tape from a side pocket, then wrapped a strip of it around a nearby tree. "Looks like old Higgs wasn't completely full of shit after all," she muttered. "Huh?" I asked. "Bert Higgs, my predecessor. He used to say that all sorts of strange stuff happened on this side of the park." "What did he say?" "Dunno. Never paid him much attention. I always figured he was just messing with me, 'cause he didn't like women in the service. I joined up in '73, and he retired 2 years later." My heart skipped a beat. There was no way that the 30-something woman in front of me had joined the park service in 1973. The unusual uniform, the old-fashioned cruiser, and bulky backpack. It was all starting to make sense. "Well, what year do you think it is?" "It's 1975. Maddie Corbin stared at me like I was crazy. "Why? What year do you think it is?" Before I could answer, a snapping twig made us both spin. The stag. I had always considered deer to be harmless, innocent animals. I cried when Bambi's mom died, and hunting had always made me queasy, but there was nothing harmless or innocent about the beast that was staring us down. Foam frothed on its black lips, and its eyes glowed with a hateful, alien light. It stomped at the ground, and that's when I realized it was getting ready to charge. "Look, oh you," Maddie started to yell, but I was already running. The primitive, monkey part of my brain wanted to scramble up a tree, but the branches were too high, and meanwhile the stag's hoofbeats were closing in. A brown blur passed beside me. Maddie Corbin. She was making for a narrow gap between two of the mossy boulders up ahead. She dived into the narrow, jagged space, and I threw myself in after her. Seconds later, antlers cracked against the rock behind me, then again and again. Ranger Corbin and I had backed as deep into the crevasse as we could. The stag's antlers were too wide for it to pass, but it still gnashed at us with its square herbivore teeth, like it was trying to eat us alive. Blood poured down its forehead, but it kept battering its body against the stone until it finally crumpled to the ground and lay still. Maddie and I looked at each other. She approached and opened one of its tightly closed eyelids with 2 fingers. The eerie light was gone from its eyes. The stag was dead. I asked Maddie if this was normal behavior for the deer around here. She looked at me like she wanted to skewer me on the stag's antlers herself. I could see why she was so frustrated. In our haste to flee the stag, we had completely lost sight of the tape-marked tree. Or so I thought. Even though Maddie had only marked 1 tree, behind us were 6 of them, each indicating that we had come from a different direction. What the hell was going on here? "Okay, so the tape isn't going to work," Maddie said numbly. "What about the rocks? These boulders had to roll down from someplace. We can follow them uphill until we're high enough to see the road." I squeezed the pink jacket in my hand. Kylie loved exploring, loved looking over the edge of high places. Would she also think to follow the big stones uphill? It was slow going. There was no path through the sea of ferns and enormous trees. No indication of direction apart from the trail of boulders. No birds sang. No squirrels leapt from branch to branch. The quiet made me paranoid. I kept looking over my shoulder, when I really should have been paying more attention to what was in front of me. I was about to take another step when I felt a weight on my shoe. Something cold and heavy slithered across my foot. I heard a rattle. No, a lot of rattles. The ferns around us were rustling, but not because of any breeze. Maddie Corbin froze. We made eye contact, and she reached, slowly, for the nearest boulder. I copied her. The feel of the rough stone was reassuring. But would I be able to scramble up it in time? No quick movements, I warned myself. Do not panic. No matter what happens, do not panic. With a shout and a kick, Maddie Corbin sprung onto the rock. Something long and writhing snapped at her as it fell from her leg. She was clinging to the rock by her toes and fingernails, but she had made it. Meanwhile, the rattling around me intensified. My blood turned to ice as the thing on my foot began to coil its way up my bare leg. Its scales were cold against my skin. The tongue of a second snake flickered against my ankle. "Maddie," I whispered. "Get going. Find Kylie. The look in Ranger Corvin's eyes as she looked back at me told me I was a dead man, but she understood that Kylie was my priority. She scrambled up the boulder and out of sight. The serpent coiled around my thigh, squeezed tighter. I held my breath, waiting for its bite, but it never came. The snake wrapped around my ankle hissed up at it. With a hiss of its own, it slithered down my other pant leg and out the cuff of my jeans. It was now or never. I very slowly lifted my boot and planted it on the rock. I would only get one chance at this, and if I fell, I was a dead man. Fangs shot out of the ferns and buried themselves in the sole of my shoe. It was all the motivation I needed. I threw myself against the rock face and clawed my way to the top of the boulder. The ground below looked deceptively peaceful from up here, and Ranger Corvin was nowhere to be found. I climbed from stone to stone until the slope of the land grew steeper. Up ahead, a jagged black cave opened in the cliff face like a hungry, toothless mouth. Several objects hung from the branches around it. More of those creepy dolls. The gruesome style was the same as before, but the clothes they were wearing were different. Where I'm going, there are lots of kids like me, Kylie had said. Did each one of those figurines represent a kidnapped child? I shivered. The breeze from the cave was musty and cold. Whatever was causing the strangeness in this part of the park clearly emanated from here. The dolls were proof enough of that. Did I really think I stood a chance against something that could vanish at will, control the minds of animals, and send a horde of snakes slithering down the side of a mountain? It didn't matter. My daughter's life was at stake. So much had changed after Kyle was born, and one of the things I left behind was my cigarette habit. I used to smoke about a pack a day, but during my wife's pregnancy, I cut it back to 0. Even so, I never stopped carrying a lighter in my pocket. I couldn't have said why. Maybe I imagined having one last Tokay in my final moments, like some 80s movie action hero. Instead, that frail piece of plastic was about to be my only source of light as I entered the cave ahead. The sloping stone ceiling grew lower and lower as I walked. I've always been claustrophobic, and soon I was afraid I would have to crawl in the dirt alongside the hand-sized cave spiders, but the path never grew so narrow. In fact, I couldn't shake the feeling that something just a little bit taller than me had been moving through here for so long that the tunnels had accommodated to its shape. Before long, the daylight and fluttering insects of the surface world were gone. There was nothing but me and my lighter, and I had no idea how much juice it had left. At any moment it might burn out, leaving me in total darkness. The flame reflected off of something up ahead. Dark and rainbow patterns shifted on its surface, reminding me of oily water, but the stuff was too thick for that. Glistening strands of it hung, mucus-like, from the ceiling. A tiny figure stood at the edge of the weird pool, looking doubtfully into it. Careless of whatever dangers might have been lurking in the shadows, I threw open my arms and ran to her. Kylie. Hi, Daddy. My daughter smiled. She didn't seem hurt, not physically at least. I asked her what she was doing here. The man in the woods says I should go for a swim. He says if I do, I'll be able to fly and talk to animals just like him. What? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How? I don't know. Why don't you ask him yourself? He's standing right behind you. At that moment, the flame of my lighter went out. I hugged Kylie to my chest and fled back the way I'd come, I hoped. My foot slipped on a loose rock, and I crashed headfirst into something that was cold, slimy, and taller than me. There was an awful, inhuman chittering noise. 6 long fingers grazed my hair as they grabbed for my head. Kylie screamed. I dragged us forward along the cave floor, ignoring the spiders skittering through my hair and down the back of my shirt. The man in the woods, whatever it was, strode slowly behind us, taking its time, enjoying this. There was a light up ahead, but that didn't make sense. Even if we had made it further than I thought, we still shouldn't have been anywhere near the cave entrance. The light bobbed closer, shone on our faces. It was a flashlight. Its beam flickered up to the thing hovering over us. Stay down and keep moving, Maddie Corvin shouted. The boom of her echoed deafeningly from the cave walls, but in the glow of her flashlight, the path to the exit was clear. There was movement behind us, a lot of movement, as though dozens of child-sized things were scurrying across the cobweb ceiling. Maddie kept firing, and Kylie and I kept running. I set my daughter down as soon as we were free of the cavern. To my surprise, I could see the creek and even the cars from where we stood, less than half a mile away. It was as though whatever disorienting power permeated the place had faded, at least for now. Moments later, Ranger Corvin backed out of the cave, her pistol still aimed into the gloom. "Did you get it?" I whispered. "I don't know," Maddie answered truthfully. "But I'm not budging from this spot until I'm sure you folks are safe. Get back to your wife and get out of here." With Kylie on my shoulders, I staggered back through the ferns. My eyes swept the ground for snakes, but like the 6 tape-marked trees and creepy dolls, the rattlers were suddenly nowhere to be found. At the edge of the creek, I spotted something shiny lying in the mud. My car keys. Heather sat up in the back of Ranger Corvin's cruiser as we approached. "You're back so soon," she called out. "How on earth did you find Kylie so fast?" From Heather's perspective, I had been gone only a few minutes. For me and Ranger Corvin, however, it felt like half a day had passed. I wondered what Maddie would find when, and if she made it out of the woods. My wife's eyes grew wide as she heard 3 gunshots from the ridge above. There was something desperate about the sound that spurred me into action. Ranger Corvin needed help, and we were the only ones who could get it for her. "I told you this was a bad place," Kylie sniffled, wiping at the cave dirt on her face. Heather clipped her into her car seat as I pulled out of the gravel turnoff and raced back down the Tulane Road to a small gas station that I had spotted near the entrance of the park. Leaving the engine running, I dashed inside. A dusty bell jingled above the door. The place was a 4-pump store that sold overpriced drinks and firewood to tourists, while locals stopped in for bait and coffee. The woman behind the counter dropped a pot of it when she saw me come running in. For Maddie Corvin, almost 50 years had passed, but she recognized me right away. Her Forest Service uniform had been replaced with a yellow gas station polo shirt, and her hair had gone gray. But her bright green eyes had lost none of their sharpness. I had no doubt that the woman at the cash register was the same person who had saved my daughter and I from certain death only hours before. "You?" she grunted, in a voice roughened by years of booze and cigarettes. "I always wondered if you would ever come walking through that door. After what happened, it's the only reason I stuck around here." When Maddie had emerged from the woods back in 1975, raving about missing children and missing time, there had been no proof to back up her claims. My family and I were nowhere to be found, and she wasn't able to locate the cave or the grotesque dolls again. The Park Service let her go less than a month later, citing mental health concerns. She had worked here at the gas station ever since, listening to the tales the locals told about odd animal behavior and unexplained sightings at the gravel turnoff by the creek. I warn the tourists about the place. I tell them that there's a dangerous bear in the area. It's easier than the truth. And who knows, maybe some of them listen. Out in the car, Kylie was getting antsy, squirming and kicking in her car seat. She'd been through so much. I made a point to grab a few of her favorite snacks from the gas station shelves, but when I went to pay, Maddie waved me away. "It's on the house," the ex-ranger smirked. "I don't know how to thank you. Forget about it. It's ancient history. You really want to thank me? Spread the word. Let people know that if they notice kids or animals acting strange in the woods, it might be the only warning they get." I promised that I would. She waved as we pulled out of the parking lot, standing just as tall and strong as she had been in the moment we met. I hoped that whatever was lurking among the tall trees behind the gas station would allow her to live out the rest of her days in peace. I hoped, too, that I wasn't taking a part of it out of the park with me. Kylie was munching contentedly on a chocolate donut in the back seat, but when I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her bright green eyes flashed up to meet my own. "Keep driving, Daddy," her voice said inside my head. "Keep driving and act like you don't know." Fourth story. I'm a park ranger, and I regret my community outreach program. I began working as a park ranger because I truly love the outdoors. Many of my fondest memories of growing up were made in the woods, exploring the miles of trails in my backyard, dragging along whatever friend I could convince to join me. I never tired of nature, constantly amazed by wildlife, foliage, and the changes in seasons. I grew to know the woods and parks around me like the back of my hand, and the only logical progression for me as I became an adult was to start working for them. My goal was to share my passion with my community, and I think this upbeat and engaged attitude coming from a young woman was refreshing, especially when compared to the stuffy old men who were occupying the other ranger positions. I moved up the ranks quickly and gained a good reputation and rapport within the community. I worked hard to make our parks accessible and interesting, which leads me to the project in question. I decided during the lockdowns that it would be fun to set up some trail cams on the less popular paths in our local state park. These were the trails only traveled by more experienced climbers, woodsmen, and navigators. They weren't places your average family would go, but offered some of the most amazing wildlife and views thanks to their remote locations. In an effort to encourage people to use and donate to the parks, I proposed my idea to share nature's beauty with the public. My boss was hesitant at first, not wanting to disrupt the natural landscape with cameras. But when I showed him how very small they were and how they'd be almost entirely camouflaged in the trees, he changed his tune. We decided to have the cams stream 24 hours with solar charging and remote connection. It would allow people trapped inside their homes to feel some kind of connection to the outdoors. And I was so excited my idea was being brought to life. We shared the live feed links on our social media pages in May of 2020, and at first we only had a few viewers. I would have preferred more, but if I could share the beauty with even just one person, it was worth it. As the summer wore on, our cams began picking up some interesting wildlife. We caught a mama bear and her cubs fishing on one cam a couple of times, and our feeds picked up views as our dedicated fans shared them with others. There was even a period of time when we had over 1,000 viewers at once, all watching eagle chicks hatch in the nest we'd found. Of course, we kept the cameras a safe distance away so as not to disrupt them, but they allowed viewers to get a look at nature no one would normally be able to see. When schools opened back up, we had a few teachers, some even halfway across the country, showing the feeds to their class. I received praise as donations flowed into the Parks Department from locals and foreigners alike, all thrilled by the documentation of removed nature we were getting. My boss was thrilled. So as I was. One night, we caught something strange on our mountainside cam. The camera was attached to a ledge overlooking a rock outcropping and the forest beyond. A few months prior, this was where we had watched the mother eagle build her nest, but now there wasn't much to see in terms of wildlife. It did provide a spectacular view of the sunrises over the trees, though, and many people tuned in for that. At first, we didn't notice anything odd, but one person in the chat asked, "Does anyone else see the trees moving?" Of course, the replies mentioned the wind, tricks of the eye, and the like, but they went on, further describing it. No, like the trees in the right corner. They're moving, like really moving. I looked, zooming my screen in on the spot the user pointed out. To my confusion, the trees were moving. There were two large ones swaying dramatically back and forth, despite everything else nearby remaining stationary. I jumped in a chat as an admin, acknowledging the comment. This movement unnerved me, as it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. I tried to hide this, though, explaining it could be a large bear climbing into branches or scratching themselves on the trunks. Within a few minutes, the swaying stopped, but the strange motion played over and over in my head that night. I couldn't figure out just what was causing those trees, and only those trees, to move. The next morning, I reported to work for my 6 a.m. shift and logged into the trail cams. All looked normal, and I found myself questioning if I had actually seen anything strange last night, or if it had been the power of suggestion from the commenter. Then I saw it again. This time it was much closer, and a few of the visible treetops at the base of the outcropping began to bend back and forth, swaying as if about to snap at any moment. I didn't know what to expect, but I sat glued to the cam while I waited for something to emerge from the woods. I saw a large, dark, clawed appendage grasp onto the bottom of the ledge, then another. They slammed down with such force the rocks beneath them cracked and split as the creature pulled itself up onto the outcropping and closer to the camera. I felt as though I were right there in front of it, unable to move. In all my life, I'd never see anything like it, not even in legends or drawings. It had two bloodshot eyes, pupils slit like a cat's, and a humanoid smile with large fangs that glistened all the way down to its chin. It was maybe 12 feet tall, but I couldn't tell for sure as it was crawling on all fours, slinking towards the camera. Its gaze never faltered as it stared directly into the lens, even 100 feet away from the well-hidden camera. Suddenly, it leapt onto its back legs and sprinted towards the hidden lens. I screamed, unable to separate myself from the screen as the unknown beast charged directly towards me. It ripped the camera off the tree, screeching as it did so, before throwing it to the ground. The camera clattered around before the feed went black and cut out. I looked at the feed and thankfully saw no one but myself had been watching. I didn't know how to, or if I even could, explain what had just happened. I wasn't sure I wanted to, and tried to forget about it the rest of the day. Maybe I had fallen asleep at my desk and imagined it, or I had food poisoning that caused me to hallucinate. At this post, I'd accept any explanation other than that there was none. That evening, another trail cam was destroyed, mysteriously going offline while, thankfully, no one was watching. Since then, we've received reports from hikers of trees moving unnaturally while they're on the trails, and all of our trail cams have gone offline. No one has been injured or even gone missing, so no one has bothered to investigate it. Most rangers say it's nothing to worry about. I, on the other hand, am full of fear. I see trees swaying on my drives home from work and have refused every field assignment I've been requested to do. I used to jump at the chance to get out of my office. I haven't even attempted to explain why to anyone, because I don't want people to go looking for this creature. I think it knew we were watching it, and it didn't want to be seen. I'm the last thing standing in its way of remaining undiscovered, and it's most definitely intelligent enough to put a stop to that. The moving trees are getting closer, and it's only a matter of time before my feed goes dark too. Fifth story. When I was a park ranger, I heard whispers in the dark. I had been working at the Graywood National Park for 10 years. I loved my job and the serenity that the park offered. The sound of birds whispering and chirping about their day filled my head as I watched the sun rise over the mountains and turn the pink clouds into a brilliant orange. Also, I knew every inch of the park like the back of my hand. As a park ranger, I've seen and heard a lot of strange things over the years. Some of them are hard to explain, and others are downright spooky. But it's all part of the job, and I've learned to take it in stride. One of the strangest stories I've heard happened a few years ago. A group of hikers had gone missing in the woods, and we launched a massive search and rescue operation. We combed the forest for days, but we couldn't find any trace of them. It was like they had vanished into thin air. Then, a week later, one of the hikers stumbled out of the woods. He was disoriented and confused, and he kept muttering about how the forest had swallowed them up. We took him to the hospital, and he eventually recovered, but he never spoke about what had happened in the woods. Another odd occurrence happened when a group of campers reported seeing strange lights in the sky. They described them as bright orbs that seemed to move in a pattern. We investigated, but we couldn't find any evidence of a UFO or anything like that. But the campers were so convinced that they had seen something otherworldly that they refused to stay in the park any longer. However, there was one area that I always avoided: the Whispering Woods, a dense and dark part of the forest where people claimed to hear strange whispers at night. It was a patch of forest where the trees grew close together and tangled branches blocked out most of the light from the moon. The canopy was so thick that it housed a complete layer of epiphytes, plants that grow in trees but never touch the ground. In some places, hanging vines stretched from tree to tree and gave a glimpse through the treetops, like ropes holding an invisible net up high. I hated to think about what might be lurking in the dark there. Some said it was ghosts whispering, while others said it was the restless spirits of trees that had been felled in a great storm many years ago. Whatever the case, I never went near it. One day, I was on my routine patrol in the drizzly, foggy forest. The musty scent of old leaves and damp soil leaked into the air as I brushed past the nameless trees. A low droning grew louder, and I spotted a silhouette through the mist. It took me several moments to adjust my vision and make out that it was an elk. Suddenly, I came across a group of terrified hikers. They were huddled together, their faces were pale, and their eyes wide with fear. They were trembling and clutching at each other, their bodies tense and braced as if expecting an attack. Their clothes were disheveled and streaked with dirt and sweat, and their breathing was shallow and rapid. They claimed that they had ventured into the whispering woods and had heard eerie voices, urging them to go deeper into the forest. The hikers had barely made it out, and their pale faces were enough for me to take their claims seriously. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. We heard these strange voices in the woods, and we don't know what to do," he said, his voice quivering with fear. I nodded, trying to calm him down. "Can you tell me more about the voices you heard?" Another hiker, a woman with short, curly hair, spoke up. "They were like whispers, but they were so clear, and they seemed to be coming from all around us. We couldn't understand what they were saying, but it was like they were urging us to go deeper into the woods." I frowned, taking mental notes. "Did you see anything unusual in the forest?" The hikers shook their heads in unison. "No, nothing. But the trees seemed to be closing in on us, and we felt like we were being watched," said another hiker, a young man with a backpack. I scanned the area, looking for any signs of danger. "All right, just follow the path and leave the woods for now," I said, and the group did so. As the sun began to set, I decided to investigate the woods and put an end to this mystery. I ventured into the forest with a flashlight and walkie-talkie in hand. The sun's light peeked through the canopy of trees, barely touching the ground and leaving everything in a deep shade. The shadows stretched out like tendrils, reaching into the distance. Mist loomed in the air, making the trees seem bigger and more imposing. The wind picked up, howling softly and rustling the leaves of the trees as if beckoning me forward. A strange stillness hung in the air, as if something hidden waited in the shadows. In the distance, I heard faint whispers barely audible on the wind. As I was getting deeper, the air became colder, and I tried to ignore the chill that ran down my spine. Then I stopped in the middle of a small clearing and started to listen. The place was bathed in a deep and eerie darkness, the moonlight filtering in through the canopy of trees. The shadows of the trees stretched out like tendrils, reaching deep into the darkness. The mist loomed in the air, making the trees seem bigger and more imposing. The ground was damp and muddy, littered with pine needles and fallen branches. A hush crept through the night air, interrupted only by the soft chirping of crickets and the occasional croak of a frog. The breeze rustled through the leaves of the surrounding trees, and an owl hooted in the distance. Then I started hearing them, but they did not come from the forest. They were in my head. They were low, almost inaudible, yet highly unsettling. It's as if 1,000 tiny voices were speaking at once, but all at once. Every syllable was whispered in an otherworldly tongue, full of unknown sounds and unfamiliar syllables. It felt like a cacophony of unearthly sounds that reverberated through my mind. Then I could make out a sentence. "Go away." As I stood there, the ominous tone of the words sent an immediate shiver down my spine. It felt like someone or something was warning me of an impending danger, and my mind quickly processed the potential risks of staying in the area any longer. Without a moment's hesitation, I turned on my heels and ran away, out from the forest. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, fueling my quick escape as every step felt like a matter of life or death. I could sense the presence of an unseen danger lurking in the shadows, and my heart raced with every passing moment. The dense underbrush and tangled branches seemed to conspire against me, but I pushed on, fighting my way through the obstacles in my path. My breathing became ragged, and my heart beat faster and louder as I ran for my life. Finally, I emerged from the forest, gasping for breath, and I realized that my whole body was trembling with fear. The warning had been too intense to ignore, and I was grateful that I had heeded it. I took a moment to collect myself and to calm my racing thoughts, try and make sense of what had just happened in the depths of the foreboding forest. What the hell was it? I muttered to myself in the comforting safety of my car while driving home 20 miles away. When I returned home, no matter how hard I tried, the memory of the foreboding whispers still lingered in my mind. Those voices were enough to keep me awake late into the night, my thoughts filled with dread and confusion as to what had happened in the forest. I decided to research the area in an effort to uncover the source of the mysterious whispers. I scoured historic records and digital newspaper clippings, hoping to find some evidence of what could have been lurking in that forest. What I found were only reports of people hearing the whispers. Also, I did find news articles with evidence of disappearances and strange sightings, but I was not sure if they were relevant or not. The thing is, those reports were from different parts of the forest each year. I was looking for a pattern, but there was nothing that could explain what had caused those whispers. Although I didn't discover any conclusive explanation for the phenomenon I heard in the forest that night, I could say with certainty that there was something strange lurking beneath its surface. I did not understand it yet. The next day, I was so scared that I called in sick to work. I needed a rest, to put myself together and process the events of the previous night. I looked out of the window. The sky was a deep shade of gray, with heavy clouds that blotted out the sun and concealed any hint of blue in their shadows. Rain poured down in sheets, puddles forming in low-lying areas and overflowing into the streets. The world outside was blurry and distorted, an endless landscape of gray and mist. The rain tapped heavily outside like a symphony of drums, creating a mesmerizing rhythm. The windows were blurred with droplets, creating a static soundtrack from the raindrops hitting the glass. The wind whipped through the trees, and the thunder rumbled like waves crashing against the shore, and the lightning flashed briefly like an explosion of light. I reclined on my couch and listened to the raindrops, but a few minutes later, I turned on the television. Soon, a report about a forest came up as the news of the day. Huge rocks, trees, and debris were strewn across the land. The force of the landslide had upturned the entire terrain, leaving a mangled mess that stretched for miles. Heavy boulders have come crashing down from the mountain, and there is destruction everywhere. Huge cracks had formed in the ground, and deep ravines had been created as far as the eye could see. Pools of muddy water reflected the dull sky, and a thick haze hung in the air. Then I realized it was the forest, where I had been working for years. The forest was completely destroyed by a landslide. Good morning. We begin this morning with a breaking news story. A massive landslide has struck Graywood National Park, causing extensive damage and destruction, the reporter said. People were walking around, carrying equipment, and searching for survivors. The landslide occurred early this morning, and it has completely destroyed the park. There are no reported fatalities at this time, but many people are missing. The cause of the landslide is currently unknown, but officials say that recent heavy rainfall may have played a role. The park was a popular destination for hikers, nature enthusiasts, and tourists. It is estimated that millions of dollars in damage have been done to the park's infrastructure and facilities. This is a tragedy. The National Park Forest was a place of natural beauty, and now it's gone. I can't believe it, a local resident said to the reporter. Recovery efforts are underway, and emergency services are on the scene. However, the park is expected to remain closed for an indefinite period. Our thoughts are with those who have been affected by this disaster. The reporter finished his news report. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and my jaw hung open in disbelief. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The whispers were not meant to cause harm. They had been trying to warn us all this time. The forest seemed to know its death was coming. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comment section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.